It's early morning in Scottsdale, and the sky's just starting to turn blue. The sun hasn't quite crept over the mountains yet, but the first hints of light are creeping into the neighborhood. You can hear the sprinklers going off in the front lawns, the kind that snap back and forth. Some of the neighbors are already heading off to work, but not me. I work from home, well, mostly. The Gingrich house on the outside looks perfect. Big windows, nice lawn, the kind of place you'd expect from someone like David Gingrich. He's 44, tall, confident. He runs his own software company, made it big a few years back, and now he's got all the money a guy could want. His wife, Claudia, well, she's 36 and was a model back in the day. You can still see it. She's one of those women that people stop to stare at when she walks into a room. They've got 2 daughters, Jenny and Gina, 12 and 10. Happy family, right? That's what it looked like to everyone else. If you didn't know better, you'd think they had it all together. But things aren't always what they seem. Sometimes, when you're not looking, the cracks start to show. Before we dive deeply into the story, I would like to ask you to like this video as it helps the channel. As a new channel, I can certainly use the help and comment when you're done, or subscribe if you liked the video and want more. Also, I would love to hear via a comment what country in the world you are watching this video. Thanks, and back to the story now. It all started small. David used to be home more, back when the business was just getting going. He'd spend time with Claudia and the kids. But as the company grew, so did his time away. He was always on his phone, always heading out for meetings, traveling for work. Claudia, she tried to fill the time. Took up charity work, ran a few fundraisers, the kind of thing rich people do when they're bored. That's where she met Paul. Paul wasn't young. In fact, he was a good 20 years older than Claudia, but he was rich. I mean, not just comfortable like David, but serious money. He was one of those guys who liked to donate big to charities. He had connections, knew everyone in town, and he took a liking to Claudia right away. At first, it was just friendly. He'd show up at events, offer to help her out with the planning, maybe donate a little extra cash to the cause. At first, Claudia didn't think much of Paul's attention. He was always around at the charity events, usually hanging back, talking to other big donors, always generous when it came to the fundraising goals. He was a man who liked to make a difference, or at least that's what Claudia thought. He had this charm, though. It wasn't the kind that hit you all at once. No, it was slow and subtle. The kind that crept up on you when you weren't looking. Although Paul was much older than Claudia, he didn't seem it. He had the kind of confidence that comes with old money. Never rushed, never worried about what people thought of him. His hair was starting to gray, but it only added to his distinguished appearance. He dressed sharp, drove expensive cars, and he knew how to command a room without raising his voice. For a while, Claudia saw him as a mentor, someone who'd been around and could offer advice, especially when it came to organizing her charity projects. She didn't have a lot of experience running big events, and Paul's guidance helped her feel more in control. He was always there with a helpful suggestion, a new connection, or a last-minute donation to make sure everything ran smoothly. Their conversations started to get longer. First, it was just business, charity work, fundraisers, logistics. But after a few months, they began talking about other things, personal things. Paul would ask about her life, about David, about how she was really doing. At first, she hesitated. Who was she to open up to this man, this donor, this older guy who was, in many ways, still a stranger? But it was hard not to. Paul had this way of making her feel seen, really seen. He'd look her in the eye, hang on every word, as though what she had to say mattered more than anything else. David didn't do that anymore. He was always busy, preoccupied with work, taking calls during dinner, constantly checking his phone. It had been so long since anyone had really listened to Claudia, and she found herself craving that attention. Their meetings became more frequent. What started as business lunches turned into more personal get-togethers. Paul would suggest a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town, where they wouldn't be seen by anyone they knew. It felt harmless at first. Just 2 friends, enjoying each other's company. But then there were the lingering looks, the casual touches that lasted just a little too long. Claudia felt a rush whenever Paul brushed her hand or complimented her in a way that felt a little more intimate than usual. She didn't stop it. In fact, she started looking forward to their meetings, putting extra thought into her outfits, wondering what Paul would say when he saw her. He was so different from David, so focused on her, so attentive. The spark between them grew until it was undeniable. One afternoon, after yet another lunch meeting, Paul leaned in closer, his hand on her arm, and kissed her. For a moment, Claudia pulled back. She thought of David, the girls, the life she had built. But the feeling of being desired, the passion in Paul's kiss, it overpowered her. She hadn't felt this way in years. Before she knew it, she was kissing him back, the thrill of it sending a surge of excitement through her. At first, it was exhilarating. The secrecy, the stolen moments, the thrill of sneaking around. It made Claudia feel alive again. She hadn't realized how much she had been missing. With Paul, there was no pressure of the daily grind, no responsibilities, no kids to take care of. It was just passion, pure and simple. She told herself it was just an escape, a fling, something to make her feel good for a little while. But Paul wasn't treating it like a fling. He wanted more. Every time they were together, he pushed for more time, more attention. He would call her late at night, demanding to know where she was, why she wasn't with him. At first, Claudia thought it was sweet. After all, it meant he cared, right? But slowly, Paul's possessiveness began to creep in. He started asking her questions. Why was she still with David? Why did she put up with him? Didn't she deserve better? Claudia tried to explain it away. David was the father of her kids. They had built a life together. She couldn't just leave. But Paul wouldn't hear it. He became fixated on the idea that Claudia was his, that they were meant to be together. It wasn't enough for him to have these stolen moments. He wanted all of her. He would say things like, "I'm the one who really understands you, Claudia. David doesn't care about you anymore. He doesn't even notice you're slipping away." It was true, in a way. David didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in his work, in his own life, to see what was happening right in front of him. But that didn't mean Claudia was ready to throw everything away. She still had the girls to think about. And deep down, part of her still loved David, even if things had changed between them. Paul, though, wouldn't let it go. His calls became more frequent, more insistent. When Claudia didn't respond right away, he would leave angry voicemails, demanding to know where she was, who she was with. He started showing up at her charity events unannounced, keeping a close eye on her, making sure she wasn't spending too much time with anyone else. The more Claudia pulled back, trying to create some distance, the more Paul pushed. He wanted her all to himself, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. It got to the point where Claudia started to feel trapped. What had once been exciting and fun now felt suffocating. She knew she needed to end things with Paul, but every time she tried, he'd find a way to pull her back in, reminding her of the passion they shared, the connection they had. He'd tell her that she was wasting her life with David, that she deserved to be happy, to be with someone who truly appreciated her. And for a while, she believed him. But deep down, Claudia knew she couldn't leave David. She couldn't walk away from her family, from her life. And that's when things took a darker turn. Paul wasn't going to let her go that easily. David Gingrich had always been proud of his work. Starting his own software company from scratch in a competitive market like Scottsdale wasn't easy, but he'd done it. By the time he hit his 40s, he was a success, respected by his peers, financially secure, and always striving for more. But as his business grew, so did the time and energy it demanded. He found himself at the office late into the night, constantly fielding calls, traveling for meetings, and planning the next big step for the company. At home, things were slipping. He didn't notice it at first. He told himself Claudia understood how busy he was. After all, his hard work was what gave them the big house, the nice cars, and the comfortable life they lived. But as the months went on, David realized he and Claudia had drifted apart. Conversations felt brief, routine. The intimacy they once shared had faded, and while he noticed it, he didn't do much to change it. Work was his escape. That's where Simone came in. Simone had been working at the company for a couple of years now, first in a lower-level position, but she quickly rose through the ranks. She was sharp, driven, and frankly, she knew how to get what she wanted. In her early 30s, Simone had the kind of energy that made people pay attention when she walked into a room. Tall, with long dark hair and a magnetic presence, she wasn't just good at her job. She was also good at making people feel like they were the only thing that mattered. David had noticed her before, of course, but it wasn't until they started working together more closely that things began to change. He would pull her into important meetings, asking for her input on big decisions. Soon, their work-related conversations extended beyond office hours. They started grabbing dinner after a long day or meeting up for drinks after late-night work sessions. To anyone else, it looked like business. Just a boss and his marketing manager working late. But to David, it felt different. Simone had a way of making David feel important, like he wasn't just another businessman trying to stay afloat. She asked questions about his vision for the company, listened when he talked about his challenges, and always had a compliment or word of encouragement to offer. She wasn't just an employee. She made him feel appreciated in a way that he hadn't felt at home for a long time. One night, after a particularly grueling day at the office, David and Simone were working late again. The office was empty, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning and the quiet buzz of their computers. They were going over a new marketing campaign, but the conversation had drifted into more personal territory. David was talking about how work had become his life, how Claudia seemed distant, how things weren't like they used to be. Simone, sitting across the desk from him, leaned in slightly, her voice soft and understanding. "You work harder than anyone I know," she said. "It's no wonder things at home are difficult. It's not easy when you have to carry so much on your shoulders." Her words were like a balm to David's bruised ego. He didn't realize how much he had needed to hear that. He looked at Simone, really looked at her for the first time, and in that moment, the air between them shifted. There was a silence, charged with an unspoken understanding. Before either of them knew it, Simone was standing up, moving closer, and then she kissed him. It was bold, unexpected, and David's first instinct was to pull away. This was wrong, wasn't it? He was married. But the kiss lingered, and the longer it went on, the less David wanted it to stop. It wasn't just about the physical connection. It was the way Simone made him feel. Desired. Important. Needed. From that night on, their relationship changed. The late nights at the office weren't just about work anymore. They would stay after hours, meeting in David's office with the blinds closed. Sometimes they'd drive to a hotel on the outskirts of town, spending hours together in a haze of passion and secrecy. David was living a double life, and for a while it excited him. The thrill of sneaking around, the adrenaline rush of knowing he could get caught. It was all intoxicating. Simone, for her part, wasn't shy about what she wanted. She wasn't interested in just being David's side affair. She wanted more. She wanted him to leave Claudia and make their relationship official. She would talk about how they could start fresh, how they could build something new together, how she could be the woman he truly deserved. At first, David would brush it off, telling her it was complicated, that he couldn't just walk away from his family. But Simone wasn't satisfied with that answer. As the months went by, Simone's demands became more direct. "You need to leave her," she would say during their late-night rendezvous. "I'm not going to be your secret forever." David would tell her it wasn't that simple. He had the girls to think about, his reputation, the company. But Simone wasn't hearing it. She wanted him, and she wasn't going to settle for anything less than everything. The tension between them started to build. What had once been passionate and thrilling now carried an undercurrent of pressure and unease. Simone wasn't content with just stolen moments and secret meetings. She wanted a real relationship, and she was becoming increasingly frustrated that David wasn't moving fast enough. "I can't keep doing this, David," she told him one night, her voice edged with anger. "You either leave her, or I'll tell her everything. Do you think she won't find out? Do you think she'll just sit by when I tell her about us?" David had never seen this side of Simone before. She was no longer the supportive, understanding woman who had once made him feel important. Now she was demanding, threatening to tear his life apart if he didn't make a choice. David felt trapped. He wasn't ready to leave Claudia, but Simone's ultimatum hung over him like a dark cloud. He tried to appease her, telling her he needed more time, that he was working on it, but deep down, he knew he was running out of excuses. The affair, once thrilling and fun, had become a ticking time bomb. It was only a matter of time before everything started to unravel. David's guilt grew heavier with each passing day. He couldn't look at Claudia without feeling a pang of shame, and yet he couldn't bring himself to end things with Simone either. He was caught between two worlds, two women, and the walls were closing in on him. Simone's threats became more serious. "If you don't leave her, I'm going to tell everyone," she warned. "Your wife, your kids, your business associates. Do you think any of them will look at you the same way after they find out about us?" David knew she meant it. Simone wasn't the kind of woman to make empty threats, and the thought of everything he had worked for crumbling because of his affair terrified him. But it wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the power Simone held over him, the control she had slowly taken. And David, for all his success and confidence in the business world, found himself powerless against her. The tension in the Gingrich house was getting thick, though no one said anything yet. David knew something was off with Claudia, but he was too wrapped up in his own mess to really figure it out. Claudia, on the other hand, was living a double life. She couldn't leave David, not with the girls involved, and besides, the money and status that came with being his wife were too much to walk away from. But Paul was getting more demanding. He wanted her to leave David, to be with him full time, and he wasn't shy about saying it. One weekend, Claudia told David she was heading out for a charity retreat. In reality, she was meeting Paul at his mountain cabin, a secluded spot he owned just a couple of hours out of town. David, suspicious, decided to follow her. When he got there, he stayed hidden at first, watching from the trees as Claudia and Paul started arguing. He could hear their raised voices through the open window. Paul was furious. He wanted Claudia to leave David, but she couldn't. The argument got heated, and that's when David rushed in. The sight of his wife and Paul in a moment like that, it was too much. Paul, being older and weaker, tried to push David away, but David was stronger. In the scuffle, Paul lost his balance and fell backward, his head slamming against the sharp corner of the stone fireplace. The sound of it echoed through the room, and then there was nothing but silence. Paul wasn't moving. David and Claudia stood there for what felt like forever, staring at his lifeless body, the blood pooling under his head. And then panic set in. They couldn't leave him there. They had to clean it up. That's what they told themselves. They wrapped Paul's body in a rug, dragged it outside, and buried it in the woods behind the cabin. They cleaned up the blood, scrubbed everything down, and tried to make it look like nothing had happened. But the guilt, the fear, it was still there. In the immediate aftermath of Paul's death, David and Claudia were in shock. They had panicked after the fight, watching in horror as Paul's body lay motionless on the cabin floor, a pool of blood forming beneath his head. David's mind raced. He wasn't a violent man, and this wasn't supposed to happen. He hadn't meant to kill Paul, but now there was no going back. Claudia was beside herself, shaking and crying, unable to process what had just happened. It was all too much. They knew they had to act fast. David quickly decided they had to make it look like Paul had simply disappeared, maybe a tragic accident while he was up at his mountain cabin alone. It wasn't the best plan, but it was all they had. Claudia, numb and terrified, went along with it. Together, they cleaned up as best they could, wiping down surfaces, moving Paul's body to his car, and driving it to a secluded spot deep in the woods where they hoped no one would find it for a long time. It was sloppy rushed. In their panic, they missed details, little things that would soon come back to haunt them. A few days later, Paul's absence was noticed. He hadn't shown up for a scheduled charity event, which was unusual for someone so involved. When friends and colleagues couldn't reach him, they reported him missing. At first, the police treated it as a routine missing person case. Paul was a wealthy man with a mountain cabin. Maybe he had just decided to take some time away, a brief retreat in the mountains to clear his head. But when officers were sent to check on his cabin, what they found started to raise suspicions. The cabin itself didn't look like a place someone had left willingly. The table was set with plates, as if for a meal. A jacket was left draped over a chair, and a phone charger was still plugged into the wall. But it was the faint bloodstains near the fireplace that immediately caught the attention of the investigating officers. It wasn't much, just a few small drops, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. Something wasn't right. It wasn't long before the investigation ramped up. Detectives were brought in, and forensic teams began processing the scene. The bloodstains near the fireplace were tested, and when they came back as a match for Paul's DNA, the missing person case quickly became a potential homicide. But there was more. Detectives noticed that cell phone data from both Paul's phone and others pinged off the local towers near the cabin on the night of his disappearance. One of those phones belonged to David Gingrich. That was the first major break in the case. David was brought in for questioning. At first, he played it cool, denying any involvement. He said he had been busy with work, that he hadn't seen Paul in months. But detectives weren't buying it. They pressed him on his relationship with Claudia, on his whereabouts the night Paul disappeared. When they confronted him with the cell phone records, David's story started to unravel. His calm exterior cracked, and he stammered, trying to explain why his phone had been near Paul's cabin that night. But it was too late. The detectives could see the panic in his eyes. As the investigation continued, more pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Simone, David's marketing manager and mistress, had been watching the news closely. She had suspected something was going on between David and Claudia for a while, but now she knew it was more than just an affair. It was murder. Fueled by jealousy and anger, Simone went to the police and told them everything she knew about David's affair with Claudia. It wasn't a confession, but it painted a picture of a man with a motive. Meanwhile, detectives were also looking into Claudia. Her relationship with Paul had become a focal point of the investigation, especially after several of her colleagues from the charity mentioned how close the two had become in recent months. Claudia, too, was brought in for questioning. She tried to keep her composure, but the pressure was mounting. Detectives grilled her about Paul, about her marriage, about where she had been the night Paul disappeared. They had already spoken to David, and their stories weren't lining up. Forensic evidence from the scene further implicated both David and Claudia. Blood was found on the carpet in the cabin, and trace amounts were discovered on Claudia's shoes, which had been carelessly cleaned but not thoroughly enough to remove all the evidence. Tire tracks near the cabin matched the make and model of David's car, and Paul's body, once discovered in the woods, revealed bruising and other injuries consistent with a physical struggle. It was only a matter of time before both David and Claudia were facing charges. The turning point came when detectives reviewed security footage from various locations around Scottsdale. Cameras near a highway leading to the mountains caught a glimpse of David's car the night of Paul's disappearance. Combined with the cell phone data, it was clear that both David and Claudia had been at the cabin. Under mounting pressure, Claudia finally cracked. She confessed to everything, spilling the details of her affair with Paul, how he had become possessive and jealous, how the confrontation had spiraled out of control, leading to Paul's death. David, too, realized there was no way out. Faced with Claudia's confession, the forensic evidence, and Simone's damning statements, he had no choice but to admit his role in the cover-up. He maintained that Paul's death had been an accident, that he had only been trying to protect Claudia when Paul attacked him. But it wasn't enough to absolve him of responsibility. The prosecution built a strong case against both David and Claudia. David was charged with second-degree murder for Paul's death, as well as conspiracy and obstruction for his role in attempting to cover up the crime. Claudia, while not directly involved in Paul's death, was charged with conspiracy and accessory to the fact for helping David dispose of the body and clean up the scene. The media had a field day with the case. A successful businessman, a beautiful former model, a love triangle with tragic consequences. It was the kind of story that grabbed headlines. As the trial approached, both David and Claudia became the subject of public fascination and scrutiny. The evidence was damning, and in the end, there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. David was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Claudia, though spared a murder charge, was sentenced to 10 years for her role in the cover-up. The once-perfect family, adored by everyone who knew them, had been torn apart by lies, betrayal, and violence. And as David and Claudia sat in separate prison cells, they were left to reflect on how their lives had unraveled so completely, and how, in the end, there was no escaping the truth. It didn't take long for the detectives to start putting things together. Paul's disappearance raised eyebrows, and cell phone records showed both Claudia and David at the cabin that night. Under pressure, Claudia cracked. She couldn't keep the secret any longer. David was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years. Claudia, for her part in covering it up, got 10 years for conspiracy. As David and Claudia were led away to serve their sentences, the question of what would happen to Jenny and Gina loomed heavy. The girls, just 12 and 10, were left without their parents, their once idyllic lives shattered beyond repair. With David and Claudia behind bars, custody of the children was granted to Claudia's sister, Ellen, who lived in a nearby town. Ellen did her best to shield the girls from the media storm, but the whispers at school, the headlines, and the scandal surrounding their parents were impossible to avoid. The girls were uprooted from the only home they had ever known, forced to start over in a new town, carrying the weight of their family's dark secrets with them. Jenny, the older of the two, became withdrawn and angry, struggling to cope with the betrayal of her parents. Gina, still too young to fully understand the complexity of what had happened, only knew that everything had changed. Their once happy family had been destroyed, and in the end, they were the ones who paid the highest price for their parents' sins. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and comment. Until the next story.